Good morning, I'm Tamara Shoemaker. When I was in high school, I developed a pet peeve. I may have developed a few of them, but this one I really remember because it happened so often that my irritation with it kind of grew and grew until I became what is now popularly known as triggered, right? This will make me sound horribly old. I don't really feel that old, but when I was in high school, we used chalkboards, right? Whiteboards were just coming into existence, I guess. And we had a few of them in our school, but by and large, chalk and dust and, those smeary green backdrops were the reality of my academic existence. And what happened was that several of my teachers, in their fervor and their hurry to cram as much information into the uncomprehending brains of their students as possible, would fill up a chalkboard with notes and points, and then they would erase that chalkboard in a hip and a hurry, and they would leave bits and pieces of those words behind. Little dots of chalk writing, like the ghosts of former words, all over the chalkboard. I know this makes no sense and possibly borders on diagnosable OCD, but my irritation with it started small, and over time it grew and grew and grew until one day I stood up from my desk, I marched to the front of the room mid-lecture, and I finished erasing the board for the teacher. It was a teacher who had a sense of humor, and I have a vague memory of him making a joke of it, and I don't know if I would have done that in any other class. And bless the man, though, that could have been much worse. But I had taken up an offense that did not belong to me, and I'd let it grow until it consumed my world in that moment. So, now to Esther chapter 5. Yesterday, Esther and Mordecai work out what has to be done in order to save the Jewish people from annihilation. And the thing that has to be done takes courage, the kind of courage that requires laying down one's own life in order to save the lives of many. And hey, look at that. There we are. We're suddenly at John 15:13, where it says in the words of the one who did it the best, "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Esther's circumstances are a salvation story, right? No, not eternal salvation like what Jesus did for us on the cross, but salvation for her people. She makes the decision to offer herself as the sacrificial lamb here in this story. So 2 verses are enough to cover this crisis point, the moment where everything hangs in breathless balance, right? But there are tense 2 verses. It says, on the 3rd day after Esther fasted with her maids in preparation for this moment, from yesterday's blog post, you can check it out there, Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. It's Esther 5:1. So can you imagine? My heart rate actually almost speeds up thinking about what Esther had to do as she walked through the palace at Susa, one with an inner court, the winter home of the king of the entire Persian Empire. It wouldn't have been like, me walking from my kitchen into my living room, right? There would have been halls to traverse and pillars to walk around and guards with sharp, pointy, weapons everywhere. It would have taken time, probably, and many purposeful, intentional steps to reach my intended target if I were her. And what she was doing was illegal. Not only was it illegal, it was punishable for the crime that she was actively committing. It was punishable by death, not imprisonment and death, just death, right? Like she appears in the entrance of the inner court, and the king stares at her a little too long and doesn't do anything. And one of those sharp, shiny weapons, from one of those myriad palace guards heads her way. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, and no time to think. This is it, no second chances. So with that scene set, the next verse is a huge breath of relief. It says, when King Xerxes saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. That's Esther 5:2. So this morning, here I sat, sympathizing with the fear that Esther must surely have been facing in those breathless moments when I thought of this verse, and it almost made me laugh in contrast because of the sheer contrast between the two. So flip over to Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1. It says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. I know that I come from a denominational tradition that has, in the past, mostly shied away from the political landscape. And even now, I don't truly enjoy politics or issues that arise from them because I'd rather ignore the whole political scene just because there's so much dirty work usually found in the conducting of kingdom and country affairs, right? But this verse brings me no end of comfort because God does intervene in the affairs of kingdoms and countries when he decides to carry out his plan. And when he appointed Esther, when he chose her to stand in her position as queen of the Persian Empire for such a time as this, and when her position required her to face down the enemy in order to save her people, God took the king's heart in his own hand, right? He directed it like a watercourse wherever he wanted it to go. Okay, so Esther touched the tip of the king's scepter, accepting his pardon for the crime that she had just committed, going to see the king without being called for. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Watercourse, you guys, a river flowing exactly where the Lord has carved out the stream bed. Xerxes is so pleased with his queen that he offers her up to half of his kingdom, half of the Persian Empire, should she but make the request. But look at this, even though Esther's life was spared in that moment, what she's getting ready to ask, the salvation of the entire nation of Jews, the salvation that lies in the king's hands, that he can grant to her, it's still a really big ask, right? She can't do it the first time he asks her what she wants, that's verse 3, or the second time, verse 6. She waits until the third time, which is in chapter 7, verse 2. I doubt she subscribed to the idiom, third time's the charm, but it turned out to be true in this case. I'm getting ahead of the story again. Esther takes a deep breath. She pushes aside the king's question with a simple request. She says, "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I've prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." Esther 5:4-5. Oh, Watercourse. The Lord has hold of Xerxes' heart, and he is paving the way for Esther's favor. So, Haman and Xerxes come together to this lush banquet given by the queen, and they're the only two guests. You have to know, right, that Xerxes is probably looking around like, okay, she really wants something. His wife is a mystery, and maybe Xerxes has the heart of a sleuth, right? Maybe he wants to solve a mystery. He follows with fascination the carrot that she dangles in front of him. Esther 5:6 says, "As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, 'Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted.'" Esther stalls one more time. She says, "My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Esther 5:7-8. And the entire reading audience gives the collective, "Ah!" Haman is sitting here listening to all this, deep in his cups, high in spirits. He's being noticed by both the king and the queen of the Persian Empire. All his earthly ambitions are being fulfilled right there in front of him. His goal is power, as much of it as he can get. And every action throughout the book of Esther that he performs, that he does, is because of power. He wants it. He longs for it. Power grab number 1, he somehow puts himself into such a position with the king that Xerxes raises him to a high place in his nobility. Power grab number 2, he seduces the king into making a law that cannot be revoked, that involves the slaughter of a nation because a Jew won't acknowledge Haman's newfound power. Power grab number 3, and this one goes back a ways and is a little bit less obvious, but it's a power grab nonetheless. He has 10 sons. According to the historian Herodotus, Persian kings sent the biggest prizes and gifts to their subjects who had the most sons. Men who had sons were second only to those who had won valor in battle. So he had 10 sons. One can only imagine the plans Haman is concocting in his head as he's the single honored guest of both the king and the queen in the dining chambers, right? What power grab can he make with the favor of both monarchs? Do you remember the old show DuckTales? And the theme song has immediately started playing in my head on repeat. Oh, great. Sometimes when Donald Duck would see Scrooge McDuck's money, his eyes would change from cartoon duck eyes to eyes with dollar signs, right, in the middle of them. And that's kind of how I picture Haman right here in this moment. His eyes are glistening with the possibilities of power and wealth as he sees them dancing almost within his reach. So he's buoyant by the time he leaves the banquet. But then, enter Mordecai. It's like somebody takes a needle and pops a balloon. He just deflates like right away. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, it says, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. That's Esther 5, 9-10. He is triggered. Things are going well for him. His plans are successful. So far, everything seems to be falling into place until Mordecai reminds him that there are things out of his control, that there is a power grab that he has not yet completed, which digs at his pride. Oh, pride. So let's scene switch to Haman's house real quick. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. That's Esther 5, 10-12. But then, here comes the kicker, because of pride. Esther 5:13 says, in Haman's words, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So in other words, Mordecai is the single thread of failure to Haman's power grabs, right? He's the single thing that keeps Haman from his plan's completion. Haman takes up an offense that does not belong to him, and he lets it grow until it consumes his whole world. He's triggered. Zeresh, Haman's wife, has a suggestion. Hey, honey, don't worry about it. Just have a gallows built 75 feet high. This would be one of those impaling poles that, according to Persian capital punishment tradition, with that height, probably meant that it was set up on the walls of the city, kind of like what the Philistines did to King Saul's body in 1 Samuel 31:10. Anyway, Zeresh goes on, go ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai displayed on it, and then that afternoon go and eat your banquet and be happy. Which just makes the content of Esther chapter 6 so satisfying. But I'll get to that tomorrow. Okay, applying the content of Esther chapter 5 hits a little close to home for many of us, doesn't it? Can you imagine taking up an offense that doesn't belong to you, right? Can you imagine getting offended over something that isn't really your issue or my issue? Can you imagine marching past the teacher to erase the chalk marks that he made, the marks that don't truly matter, but because you've allowed yourself to dwell on it and fixate on it, it has built and grown into a monster in your mind, and you lash out sometimes to your own destruction. We've got to stop being offended. We've got to stop being triggered, stop picking up the battles that don't belong to us, because guess what? And listen carefully, this is super important. This is what the Lord says to you. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle belongs to the Lord, not you, not me. Watercourse. We don't dig the trenches, y'all. The Lord paves the way wherever he pleases. And I will see you tomorrow for Esther chapter 6.